So I'm just going to briefly introduce the event and our speakers, and then we'll get going. The trigger for this event, which I'm sure you all know about, but I'll just recap it, is things that have happened in the last month or so in the state of Guerrero in Mexico. On the 26th of September, local police killed 6 people, including 3 trainee teachers, students of the Escuela Normal Rural of Ayotzinapa. And the same day, 43 fellow students disappeared, allegedly kidnapped by the police, possibly by elements or by other gunmen as well. It's not entirely clear still. So this is the trigger for this event. And really the aim of what we're putting this panel together is to try and put the raw facts of the case, los hechos, in some kind of broader political, social, historical context. Now, at the risk of stating the obvious, this is not a very easy thing to do. It's difficult. The events are still unfolding. If you're reading the news, the graves are still being exhumed. Bodies are, the head of one of the cartels, which has been allegedly implicated in this, I think yesterday conveniently committed suicide. So things are still unfolding. So that's one difficulty. It's also difficult, obviously, because an air of secrecy, not to mention terror, hangs over a lot of this, so it's difficult to get basic facts and information. But I also think it's hard because events like this also raise broader issues of historical perspective and collective memory. Maybe I'm just saying this because I'm a historian, but I think these events are kind of infuriating and upsetting, but they're also intellectually stimulating for these reasons as well. Just to give you an example of this, when I started becoming interested in modern Mexico in the sort of late 1990s, Mexico stood out in a Latin American context for being relatively stable, relatively peaceful. I say relatively, emphasizing there, compared with the rest of Latin America. Mexico didn't have a Pinochet, didn't have a genocide, although perhaps now we think that maybe it did in some way. But that was what it was known for comparatively, and also for having a very long, relatively peaceful, frustratingly long but peaceful democratic transition. That was the main story. That was the sort of distinguishing thing for Mexico. If you want a sort of potted version of this, you could read a book published in 2005 by the New York Times reporters in Mexico, Julia Preston and Samuel Dillon, called Opening Mexico. It sort of encapsulates this version of Mexico's history. Now, from the perspective of today, 10 years or so later, or 15 years later, this old interpretation of what made Mexico distinctive looks profoundly incongruous and perhaps unconvincing. How do we get from there to here? Maybe the old interpretation was wrong or exaggerated. I personally think it was exaggerated in important respects. But the basic point I'm making is that in order to understand the present, understanding the present raises important questions also about the recent past. So, with those comments to begin with, we're fortunate to have 3 people who are very well placed to offer some context for these events in Guerrero. First of all, I'll just introduce you all before we begin. First, we have Panelists Padilla at the end of the table. Panelists is a associate professor of history at Dartmouth College in the States. She's the author of Rural Resistance in the Land of Zapata, published in 2008, which is a study of the Jaramillistas in the state of Morelos. She's also the co-editor of a recent journal edition in the Journal of Iberian and Latin American Studies, I believe, Latin American Research, on a fascinating collection of essays looking at some of the new sources we have for the recent past, Mexico's secret police files. And I believe she's now working on the history of public school teachers in Mexico since the 1940s. We also have Dr. Pa Engstrom. Pa is a lecturer in human rights here at the Institute. He's also the co-chair of the London Transitional Justice Network. And finally, we have Maria De Vecchi, who's a PhD candidate here at the Institute as well. Maria is researching the history and the sociology of enforced disappearances in Mexico since, I think, the 1970s, more or less. And she's particularly looking at the responses of victims groups and the government to enforced disappearances across that time span. I should end finally by thanking Maria particularly, who's really been the force getting this panel together at very short notice. So thank you very much, Maria. And without further, we'll have time for questions at the end, I should say. And the other thing I want to say is that the talks are going to be recorded by video, I believe, by this gentleman over here. And we will be turning the recording off when it comes time for questions. So I just wanted to make a note of that. And what we're going to do is sort of start at the beginning first and sort of move forward in time. So we're going to begin with Panelists, and then Maria, and then Peg.
Thank you. Yeah, I also want to thank Maria for organizing this, and of course the Institute for hosting us, and fellow panelists. I look forward to discussion and also with you on questions. So my work is on the history of the normales rurales. I'm writing a book on the history of these institutions and how they developed from the 1940s on. So what I provide here is just sort of some of that historical perspective that I hope will help highlight what the significance of these latest violence against normalistas means. And I want to start off with just some images here that I think will illustrate some of the talks that some of the themes that I will be covering in my talk as I go along. So I'll just go through some of these images first. And this, you guys are probably all familiar with La Maestra Rural by Diego Rivera, the famous muralist, of course, which is painted on the Secretaría de Educación Pública, the Ministry of Public Education in Mexico. And I just wanted to show this image because it's sort of an iconic image in terms of the place of the rural school teacher in modern Mexico or in the revolutionary project, right? It has this air that the teacher is out in a makeshift classroom. She's a woman, perhaps signifying a little bit of the profession that has historically been accessible to women, but also women being taken out of the home a little bit more in the revolutionary project. And it's intimately linked to farming the land or cultivating the land. So you have this idea that rural education is a national project linked to land redistribution and undertaken by the revolutionary state and overseen and protected by this guard, right? So the presence of the state in this image is to protect the schools, to protect them, of course, probably from the cristeros, the religious groups against secular education, or to protect it from landowners that were angry about potential land redistribution, right? So that's an image of the state and how the teachers portrayed in that. And then I want to move forward to this image of repression of students back in 2007 of these rural school teachers, right? That's what the normales rurales were set up to, was to train these teachers. It was published in La Jornada, as you see on December 1st, after a demonstration by these youngsters. And you can see how the state reacted to them, right? So the symbolism here is the presence of the state not protecting rural teachers anymore, but repressing them. This next image, it's a little bit before then, back in 2000, some of you may have heard, this is at the rural normal of El Meche in Hidalgo. And this happened, these people actually laid on the ground are policemen, that the school had been taken over by the military, or the federal police, actually, who had arrested about over 300 students, jailed them who had been taken to school and were demanding certain rights. So the police came over, took it over, and the whole community mobilized against the military takeover of this school. Captured, I think it was about 50 of the policemen, took off their shirts and tied them up there, and only freed them when the normalistas were themselves freed. And this image actually circulated the media as an example of the militancy, the political militancy and power of the normales rurales and the communities themselves, because this wasn't just this community supporting them. And this is just to give you an idea of what some of these schools look like. They were built in old haciendas or old land estates sometimes. And the symbolism there is clear, right? The revolution took land away from the old power holders and turned them into a public benefit, where the place where the sons and daughters, the parents who were previously exploited on these haciendas, right? The narrative goes, now house poor youngsters, right? So these, some of these normales are effectively on old haciendas. Those that were not were made to look like haciendas, right? Again, to emphasize that point. This is one in Michoacán. And this is a picture of the rural normal in Ayotzinapa, the place where the students who were most recently killed and disappeared took place. All of these normales, all of the ones I visited, which have been quite a few, have murals that sort of celebrate their history, but also celebrate a history of struggle, of constant struggle. So this idea that they are centers of political radicalism sometimes gets used to discredit them, but it's also a history that they very much defend. You can't completely see it here, but one of the things that banner reads is, "For a socialist revolution, long live worker peasant unity." That gives you an idea of the discourse they proclaim. They celebrate heroes such as Zapata, probably Mexican hero, but also Che Guevara, and you can see the hammer and sickle, prominently displayed with the slogan there of "Workers of the World Unite." Again, an example of their ideology. This is a cafeteria also at Ayotzinapa with familiar figures to you all, I trust. And at the top, it reads, for those who don't read Spanish, "All the philosophers of the world have done is interpret the world in different ways. What is needed is to change that world." So you can see the sort of mission that they see themselves to be a part of. This is also at Ayotzinapa. When I visited this school, this was shortly after the assassination of two normalistas that took place in December 2011. The school then was taken over by the students, and that's when I went. So what they're doing here is making some banners that I'll show you in a minute. But again, the types of who they have here, again, Lenin, but also over there they have Che Guevara alongside Lucio Cabañas, a guerrilla leader from that studied at Normal Rural at this one, and Genaro Vasquez, who was a rural school teacher though didn't study at Normal Rural. Both guerrilla leaders that, as you can see, they celebrate. One of the what it says over there is, "Those who witness injustice and don't change it are committing it themselves." This is another normal in the state of Morelos. And, as you can see, you're familiar with Zapata, but what it says here is the normalismo, long-lived, normalismo is alive. And it says, because to be a proletarian is not a crime. And what these types of murals illustrate, or these types of proclamations show you, is the history of attack that they feel that they have been a part of, right? A consistent will to destroy these institutions, and they're sort of saying, but why? We're proletarian, and that's not a crime. Again, this shows, I think, again, how they conceive their history, sort of an heirs, heirs to long history of other struggles. You have, the EZLN, the Zapatistas, the Oaxaca rebellion of 2006. You have at the center, of course, Che, and then Marcos as an outline. But also the police that's always attacking those popular struggles, right? And it says, the people who struggle are not criminals. That's the banner that the students were making in 2011 to protest the killing of their fellow students. Aguirre, it said Aguirre, ordered me to kill them. Aguirre is the current governor right now of Guerrero, right? So once again, he's at the center of killing normalistas. Right here it says Guerrero cumple asesinando. Guerrero makes, it's sort of a spoof on its campaign promises. Guerrero does by its word and assassinates, right? Sort of macabre here. So I think this is the last one, a replica of the first mural I showed you. But Alveo Rivera, again, the picture isn't very good. They tried to, paint it on their normal. But what's really interesting about that is right on the very bottom here it says, as long as there is poverty, the rural normales have a reason to exist. And again, this is addressing another attack that they constantly feel, and that's that they're relics of the past. Why are we still having them? They're long gone past. They're not even any more peasants in Mexico. The rhetoric goes, why have these institutions to educate them? So I think that I speak for all of us here when I say that even given the continual news of violence from Mexico, this particular act of repression was pretty shocking. Normalistas have long been targeted by authorities, but the result was usually a jailing or removal of them from their places of protest. Right, in December 2011, 2 Normalistas were killed in a skirmish. But really, especially if these 43 students turn out to be dead, it'll be the worst student massacre since, I think, the Corpus Christi massacre in 1971. And for years, this should be understood within a context of, for years, critics have been warning that this militarization, dealing with the drug crisis through militarization, has produced the killing of social activists, not just those involved in the drug war. And so I think what this attack shows in some ways are the connections between the state and drug organization, resulting in the assassination of a group of students, of normalistas, that the state has actually long had a contempt for anyway. So what I want to do then is provide a historical context about the significance of these schools in the 20th century political landscape and part of the 21st. The schools were founded as a result of the revolutionary struggle of 1910, 1920. This was a vast, complicated struggle, but resulted in the triumph of the more reformist or bourgeois faction over and the defeat of the agrarian faction led most prominently by Villa and Zapata. Yet, social reforms were incorporated into the resulting project, which shows the importance of that struggle. And among these social reforms, the most significant or transcending for the majority of the population was the labor legislation, land rights, the proclamation of Mexico's subsoil rights, that they were property of the nation, and significantly free public secular education. And the normales fall under this, right? The normalistas know that they have a right to public education and that it's the state's responsibility to provide it. And the first normal was founded in the 1920s, but they really received their most significant push during the 1930s under the Cardenista regime, under the presidency of Lázaro Cárdenas. He expanded them, he created new ones. They actually numbered, in various incarnations, 36. And they were made explicitly for sons and daughters of campesinos, of peasants. That was a requirement to enter the school, to be poor and be from the countryside. At the schools, they received room and board. They were boarding school, a modest scholarship, and were guaranteed a teaching position after they graduated in the countryside. They were given an explicitly political charge as teachers. It's your role once you graduate to organize the people, to demand their rights. That's what they were told. That was part of their project. And this was also reinforced by the state's short-lived socialist policy of socialist education. So all this insignia that you see references to socialism doesn't come from the la nada. It has its origins in the 1930s policy of socialist education that was short-lived. Like I said, the state overturned it in the 1940s, but it stayed at the normales rurales. And so part of what I look at in my book is try to explain why these schools have this history of militancy, of political radicalism. And I find many reasons, which I will go through here quickly. One of them has to do with what I already mentioned, the fact that socialist education had a staying power at the normales. Students, so even though it was overturned, students took it upon themselves to preserve it, even to this day, maybe not as part of the curriculum, but part of their organizing strategy. They formed the Federation of Socialist Campesino Students of Mexico, and this is a student group, probably the oldest student group in Mexico, that has committees at every single normal and is in charge of doing political organizing for the incoming class. Again, still to this day, though it's semi-clandestine because it's been so persecuted. Another reason that I find for the particular militancy of these schools is because of the origins of poverty that these students come from. This was sometimes their only chance to get an education, their only chance to access a profession of any kind, the professional world, and also sometimes just their only chance to get school beyond 6th grade, as the countryside wasn't exactly full of elementary schools, much less junior highs or high school. And as the situation in the countryside continued to worsen throughout the 20th century, it became more important to have an education. These schools, held special possibilities. Another reason that I found is that the lived experience of the students there, the way they recount them, the way they remember them, the transformation they went through there, often going from campesino, from peasant to professional, or from peasant to student to professional, the way women's identity were transformed, this idea that indigenous people somehow became mestizo. So, all these identities were expanded and contracted, and so hierarchy was denaturalized, both at the institutions themselves, but more broader. And also just the structure of these institutions that had as a requirement to work the land, because when they were teachers, they were supposed to teach how to work the land more efficiently, to have farm animals, dignified the campesino way of life. It validated it and said that it was something important. So it gave them the illusion that, or the ideal that it was important to preserve this lifestyle or to defend it. There also the original charge, the kind of the first, the idea of rural school teachers from the 1920s was that they were going to be missionaries of sorts to undertake a new order, right? Apostles of a new order, of a new just state that had just overthrown this repressive dictatorship, right? So a lot of them took this rhetoric seriously, that they were going to implement this new, more just social project. So when the state abandons that by abandoning their schools, by abandoning their the countryside, by siding with those in power, they sort of turn this state-building project into one of social justice. So in terms of their militancy or their radical nature, it's associated in part because of the images I showed, the way they organize, but it also because some very prominent guerrilla leaders come from these schools. So Lucio Cabañas, probably one of the most famous post-revolutionary guerrillas, studied at Ayotzinapa, this school in Guerrero, and led a guerrilla movement in that state from about 1967 to 74, which was eradicated through a dirty war, maybe what you were alluding to, that included death flights, mass killings, tortures, all the signature moves that we tend to associate with the Southern Cone. There was a commission in the 2000s to investigate this, but no one was ever held accountable. There are other two famous guerrilla leaders from the northern states of Chihuahua, Pablo Gomez and Arturo Gamis, who either taught at or graduated from the Normal Rural de Salaices in Saucillo in Chihuahua. They led an attack on the military barracks in Ciudad Madera in 1965, kind of model after Moncada in Cuba. So it's important to keep these struggles in mind, and indeed the normalistas today continue to celebrate them and invoke them with pride. That some of the muralists are of Lucio Cabañas, of Genaro Vázquez, of and other schools of Gamis, and they look at these guerrilla movements with pride. The problem is that the mainstream rhetoric, or the official version, looks at these examples to reinforce their own rhetoric that these schools produce criminals, social agitators, right? And this is because they ignore the long history of peaceful mobilizations that drove Gamis, Gomez, Lucio Cabañas into armed struggle, right? They defend them as a sign of campesino, of peasant dignity, of heroes who paid the ultimate price, like Zapata himself. But so I want to go over quickly the types of different attacks that the normales rurales have historically faced, given this history of political organizing. One is just neglect. Much of them remained abandoned after Cárdenas left office. Their infrastructure, the food that they were entitled to, the scholarship students were entitled to, that was just, the government just ignored it. That's why some of them had to close. They just couldn't keep running. In order to stay open, the students often had to mobilize to get anything, to get food, to get scholarships. So this is what earned them that reputation, because they're always mobilizing, they're always taking over roads or road blockades or buses, right? They were just doing it to get what was their right as students of these schools. In 1969, Díaz Ordaz, the same person who was president during the 1968 Tlatelolco massacre, closed 15 of the 29 normales rurales that were in existence at that time, calling them communist nests and guerrilla seedbeds. The governor of Chihuahua called them Bolshevik kindergartens, you know, all this rhetoric. Students didn't take this line down. They tried to resist it. They tried to occupy the schools, but the army came in. Many students were then, you know, given a choice: you get on this bus to go to this new school, or your career is over. Another form of attack has just been the constant maligning of these institutions that creates a narrative that justifies their closure. Or the repression of the students. And that's the case, for example, with that third image I showed you of where they had taken the police and they were lying on the ground. That circulated not as an example of like, look, you know, we negotiated from a position of strength to get our students back, but look at what these criminals from the normales do. And 5 years later, that school was closed. And you know, under this narrative, so the El Meche no longer exists as a normal rural. Students are reported, normalistas rurales are talked about as being lazy, rowdy, destroying property, engaging in antics just for the sole purpose of undermining the social order. Indeed, one of the local Guerrero newspapers, right after the September 26th report, had it front headlines: municipal police the public celebrates the municipal police imposing order. Like so again, celebrating this. So the fact that they focus on their tactics, so taking over buses, kidnapping buses is what the media calls it, blocking roads, throwing rocks, rather than the issues for which they're fighting, again reinforces that narrative. As I said earlier, the schools are portrayed as relics of a bygone era, that somehow these kids are defending some sort of idealistic or ideal past that has no place in a modern Mexico under a new project that seeks to create an economy, an efficient and thriving economy. This was the logic of, for example, Gordillo, head of the teachers of the official teachers union, linked to the state, a very powerful, until recently, political figure who declared that these schools should all be, citing that they were communist nests, said that they should all be turned into schools where to form tourist technicians, técnicos en el turismo, which is probably just a fancy word for saying that they should be restaurant and hotel workers at resorts. But that gives you again an idea of what the political projects of those in power are having, and why hence the militancy of these schools in defending a noble profession like that of being a teacher, despite the fact that teachers are so maligned. Finally, I don't think we can ignore the racism or the racist element in the attack on these students. These are poor students, poor youth from the countryside, or the countryside's equivalent in today's day and age, shantytowns or urban sprawl. Many of whom are indigenous origin. So there's always, when they have demonstrations, when they block roads, when they're demanding food or efficient running of their schools, electricity, there's a sort of element of how dare they? They should just be happy they have a school, you know. And so I think this reinforces again their criminalization in a similar way, I would say, in which African Americans and Latinos are criminalized in the U.S. I mean, I don't know if this is a coincidence, but when the students were killed, the first round of killing of the normalistas this past September, their bodies were left there to lie uncovered for 6 hours. I mean, that, at least for someone who lives in the States, evoked the image of Mike Brown, the unarmed African American who was shot in Ferguson, and his body was left like that for 4 hours, right? So the political acts they undertake, taking over commercial buses, blocking roads, occupying buildings and their schools, are treated like criminal acts. So if you think about this in this way, one of the things I see about this latest attack on normalistas in this light, I almost see it as the culmination of both decades of criminalization of these schools and of the students, and what happened, the culmination of that and the relationship between a state where it's sometimes impossible to know where the government starts and the cartels end. So thank you.
In my intervention, I wanted to set the context of enforced disappearances in Mexico, to highlight that this is a story of over 40 years. I am working on this topic for my PhD here at the Institute. So what I will present here is part of the work I've done in the last month, in the last year. First of all, how do we define enforced disappearances? In the Article 2 of the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances, these are defined as, and I quote, the arrest, detention, abduction, or any other form of deprivation of liberty by agents of the state, or by persons or groups of persons acting with the authorization, support, or acquiescence of the state, followed by a refusal to acknowledge the deprivation of liberty, or by concealment of the fate or whereabouts of the disappeared person, which place such a person outside the protection of the law. End of quote. Enforced disappearances are a crime against humanity and a continuous crime that is committed every day until the disappeared is found. This means that the disappearances that occurred 40 years ago are still being committed every day as long as the whereabouts of the disappeared are not revealed. In my research, I argued that there are two main periods of enforced disappearances in Mexico. The first period goes from the late 1960s to the 1980s, and the second from 2007 up until now. It is important to emphasize that even when only those two periods are being presented here in my research, these are not the only ones in which enforced disappearances have been carried out. But those are the periods in which this crime has been committed on a greater scale and at a national level. The Mexican government started using enforced disappearances in the late 60s as a way to deal mainly with rural and urban guerrilla members, their supporters, and some other political opponents. As Panelists mentioned, rural guerrillas started in Guerrero with the uprising of Cárdenas Governments in 1958. The situation in Mexico's countryside has historically been of enormous poverty and marginalization, and being one of the most marginalized states in the country, Guerrero has been home of a variety of resistance movements and of governmental responses to these organizations. The two main rural guerrillas of the second half of the past century were those of Lucio Cabañas and Genaro Vázquez, both in Guerrero and both with an important popular base in Guerrero's countryside. Urban guerrillas have their roots in Rubén Jaramillo's struggle and in the attack to the Madera barracks in 1965 in Chihuahua, Mexico. Men and women in different urban centers of the country also decided to take up arms against the government as a result of the constraints for participation in the political sphere, the repression to social movements, the lack of representation in the leftist parties, the bad quality of life, and the poverty that had no perspective of getting better. Sergio Aguayo talks about the existence of at least 29 guerrilla groups in Mexico during the 60s and 70s, most of them in urban areas. Even though repression was not carried out to the same extent as elsewhere, the Priista state did rely on violence and on the restriction of the political opponents for its perpetuation in power. The repression to guerrillas was carried out in two different ways. Rural guerrillas were repressed mainly by the military, with a territorial logic and paying special attention to their support base. Entire villages were attacked, and having the last name Cabañas was crime enough to be killed or disappeared. On the other hand, urban guerrillas were repressed in a more selective way, targeting the guerrilla groups and guerrilla members to be captured through intelligence tasks performed by the regime's political police. The repression of political opponents throughout the continent was part of the fight against international communism promoted by the United States. The first registered enforced disappearance was committed in Guerrero in May of 1969, when military officials kidnapped Epifania Villes Rojas, a teacher with links to Genaro Vázquez group. The last information about Epifania Villes is that he was taken to Mexico City's #1 military camp the day after his abduction. Since then, his whereabouts remain unknown. After this disappearance, this crime was committed regularly by the armed force, security agencies, and by paramilitary groups. The number of people disappeared for political reasons in the period from the late 60s to the 80s grew from 600 to more than 1,300, depending on the sources consulted. The exact number of people disappeared is difficult to be established due to the clandestinity and secrecy of this crime, but also because this is usually an underreported crime. Enforced disappearances for political reasons were used largely during those decades, but they have continued in Mexico, not only because, as I said, these are continuous crimes that are still being committed every day until the disappeared are found, but also because there has not been a single presidential sexennium since 1969 without new enforced disappearances. The second period of enforced disappearances in Mexico is the one that starts with Felipe Calderón and follows with Enrique Peña Nieto's so-called war on drugs. Arriving to office with little credibility after a possible electoral fraud, Calderón decided to use the military, a very well-respected institution in Mexico, as the key piece in the war on drugs in order to get social approval and liking. Contrary to this, his decision brought a human rights crisis. When Calderón started his mandate, a great portion of Mexican territory was controlled by organized crime. There was a battle between cartels that generated violence. The situation with the U.S. was tense because of the violence in the border, and there was a rise in drug consumption within the country. The violence associated with drug trafficking had escalated between 2005 and 2006. Calderón made then the decision of making security one of his 5 priorities, yet failing to address how human rights were going to be protected during this strategy, as Alejandra Anaya argues. While in other Latin American countries the democratization process included the return of the military to the barracks, the contrary happened in Mexico, where the governments have given a more important role to the military in the last 2 decades. This militarization of the war on drugs brought a serious wave of human rights violations, creating what for Human Rights Watch is, and I quote, a climate of violence, lawlessness, and fear in many parts of the country, end of quote. In a report published last year by that organization, they affirmed that the situation of enforced disappearances in Mexico is one of the most severe crises of disappearances in the history of Latin America. The exact number of people disappeared in Mexico is still unknown. Some organizations talk about 42,000 people disappeared, while the last official figure is of more than 22,000 people not found, no localizados. It is important to mention that in the last months, official reported figures have fluctuated greatly without offering transparent information on how the government has treated those lists. The change in the official discourse from talking about disappeared people to people not found or not localizados is also relevant. If establishing the number of people killed, tortured, or disappeared in this period is hard, establishing how many of these crimes were actually committed by state officers is equally complicated without proper investigations. In this regard, national and international human rights organizations have documented cases of the direct and indirect involvement of public servants in the first disappearances over time. While in the 70s and 80s the victims of this crime were mainly related to social movements, protests, or guerrillas, in the context of the war on drugs the targets are not so clear. In this period, the broader population may be also victim of these crimes. Boys, men, girls, young and adult women may be disappeared. There are a variety of hypotheses of why these disappearances are happening in the current context, including the disappearance on the basis of specific technical skills, the disappearance for human and organ trafficking, or for sexual exploitation, the use of young men and women in forced labor, the recruitment for organized crime, and the punishment for the lack of cooperation with drug cartels. Besides all of this, the kidnapping of people for terrorizing communities in order to confront them is also one of the hypotheses for the disappearances. It should be said that besides these attacks to the large social body, human rights advocates, journalists, and relatives of the victim have also been harassed, killed, kidnapped, or disappeared. With this, those who are raising their voices to stop the disappearances have also suffered this crime. A full understanding of these crimes will be possible only when the government actively investigates and solves each one of them. These periods of disappearances are linked, among other things, by the impunity of the cases. In Mexico, more than 90% of the cases of reported disappearances are not even investigated. According to the United Nations Working Group on Enforced and Voluntary Disappearances, as well as Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and Mexican human rights NGOs, the resolution of the cases has not been done. As the working group puts it, sufficient efforts for knowing the whereabouts of the victim, for punishing those responsible, and guaranteeing the right to truth and reparation have not been undertaken by the Mexican government. The case of the attacks against the students of Ayotzinapa is terrible, outrageous, and painful. These events are as terrible as something can be. Yet, a big part of how terrible they are is precisely that they are not unique, and that this has been happening in Mexico for a long time now. As I said before, hundreds of people, the majority of them from Guerrero, remain disappeared since the late 60s, 70s, and 80s, and around 20,000 people have disappeared since 2007. The disappearances of these students are then a result of this history. Now I would just like to address some particular points of what has happened with the students of Ayotzinapa and their families, and relate them with other events occurred in the past. As we know, in Iguala, 43 students were disappeared, but this is not the only example of group disappearances. Other examples can be found. For example, a case in which 10 men from Guanajuato were illegally detained in 2011 by local police in Zacatecas as they returned from a hunting trip. According to 2 members of the group who managed to escape, police officers blindfolded and interrogated the men about whether they had ties to organized crime. Then local police handed 8 of the detainees to armed men at a gas station in Zacatecas. The 8 men are still disappeared. As we saw before, impunity has many implications, one of them being the reoccurrence of crimes by the same perpetrator. José Luis Abarca, mayor of Iguala and probably one of the men responsible of the attacks to the students, went into hiding after asking for a license. There were already reports of his links with the organized crime, and there were also reports that he had killed a social activist in May 2013, but the justice failed to investigate his responsibility in these prior crimes. The failure to investigate, says Human Rights Watch in the 2013 report, contributes directly to more disappearances. They present in that report some cases in which the same groups affected several people in different events precisely because there wasn't an investigation even when there were complaints against them. Another point to be highlighted is the lack of search for the disappeared alive. According to the families, governmental officials are searching for the students dead, not alive. This is the way in which the local and federal governments have responded in Mexico for a long time, and this is why, for example, one of the 7 demands of Fuerzas Unidas por Nuestros Desaparecidos en Coahuila is the search for life, what they call búsqueda de vida, following international standards in case of enforced disappearances. It has also been documented in this case that the local authorities asked the parents of the disappeared to go and search house by house in Iguala for their sons. Again, national and international organizations have reported for decades that in Mexico, most of the times the relatives are the ones who have to conduct the investigations, as the ministerial officers fail to do it. Another aspect is how the local and federal governments appear to be acting more for the media than for the protection of the victims. The parents of the disappeared reported that they became aware of a new mass grave found in Guerrero because they saw it on the news and not by direct information of the recently created Victims Attention Unit that should have informed them about this finding. A similar situation occurred earlier this year in Coahuila, where the relatives of the disappeared were working with the government to search for their relatives, and they saw in the passport and a double television show how the government was using mechanical excavators to remove bodies found at a mass grave, breaking all the international protocols for the a few examples of how understanding what is happening in Guerrero needs a historical perspective of what has happened in Mexico in terms of enforced disappearances. Precisely to see that this is terrible, but this is not an isolated event. The different governments in Mexico have failed to comply with their international obligations in terms of enforced disappearances, particularly in relation to the guarantee of non-repetition established in international legislation. Just to finish, let me say that the events of Iguala have nonetheless been unique in one thing. They have attracted a wave of national and international attention, condemnation and solidarity to human rights crisis in Mexico, not seen before, which should be a turning point in this matter. That is why I believe that from every corner we should keep on demanding the government to comply with its obligations in terms of human rights, starting with the immediate presentation of the students alike.
Thank you for the invitation, Maria, and thank you really very much for organizing this. You asked me, I was asked, to address the question of whether and in what ways the situation in Mexico, as demonstrated in some ways by the displaced students, what extent it amounts to a human rights crisis. And before it becomes very apparent that I'm a fraud in this setting, I'm not a Mexicanist, nor am I an international lawyer, and I'm by no means a historian. Okay. The second kind of caveat here has been alluded to by kind of previous speakers here, that facts are as elusive as ever when it comes to the violence that characterized contemporary Mexico. But from what I can gather from news reports, and for what it may be worth discussing these issues with colleagues over the weekend in Mexico, that there is a fundamental agreement around the main facts of the events. Yeah? And to that end, I kind of like to just make 4 points, and I'm trying to be brief so that we can open up discussions here. The first point, Mexico's human rights crisis. What does it consist of? Let me just present some headline figures, and Maria has already referred to those. So, Maria referred to the Human Rights Watch report that was published in February 2013. Mexico has disappeared. And the report documented nearly 250 disappearances during the Calderón administration, including 149 cases in which there was compelling evidence of enforced disappearances, involving state agents from all branches of the country's security forces. In May 2014, the Interior Minister said that the number of people missing and disappeared had dropped to 8,000. In June the same year, the Deputy Prosecutor for Human Rights and the Attorney General's Office said that the 8,000 people only included people who had gone missing during the Peña Nieto administration. Yeah. Later that same month, the Minister of Interior announced that the whereabouts of 16,000 people remain unknown. In August, the government said the actual number of people not found was more than 22,000. Yeah. So, the state claims not to know, government claims not to know, and they throw out figures that vary in thousands. Okay. Now, in terms of torture, Amnesty International reports that torture and ill-treatment is out of control in Mexico. The number of reported complaints in 2013 was 1,505, and this number was 600% higher compared to 2003. And these are figures from the National Human Rights Commission. For those who follow Mexican politics and follow the National Human Rights Commission, you also know that the National Human Rights Commission is under very, very severe criticism. So it's perhaps fair to assume that these numbers are at best hugely, or at worst I should say, huge underestimates. Again, between 2010 and the end of 2013, the National Human Rights Commission received more than 7,000 complaints of torture and other ill treatment. There's been a reported drop in number of complaints, but everyone who does work in this area knows that the drop in number of complaints could say as much about the institution that's received a complaint as to the reality that this depicts. Fear of torture is widespread, and International has an ongoing campaign on torture. And they found in its surveys of Mexico, comparatively speaking, this is a global survey, that 64% of Mexicans are fearful or scared of being tortured if taken into custody. And of course, reports of torture and ill treatment have increased during the period, particularly after 2006, within the context of the government's so-called war on drugs. Impunity, and Maria referred to this, impunity for those who torture is rife. Yeah? According to figures from the Federal Judicial Council, reported by Amnesty and the associated organizations, federal courts dealt with 123 prosecutions for torture between 2005 and 2013. Just 7 of those resulted in convictions under federal law. Yeah? So impunity, widespread impunity. 90% I think is a very optimistic, 10% accountability is possibly quite an optimistic estimate. Now, behind these numbers and behind these statistics, of course, are people as victims, as perpetrators, as bystanders, and of course many located in between these various categories, and these categories are of course often very misleading. So it is in this sense that Mexico could be considered to be in a human rights crisis, and it has been for some time in the context of its very own war on drugs. And please note here that I have not even referred to the many other challenges facing Mexican society that could be characterized as human rights challenges, from entrenched socioeconomic inequality, gender violence, through to discrimination of indigenous communities, to just name a few. So what does Mexico's human rights crisis consist of then? Okay, whenever I'm in doubt, I go to the OUP's Encyclopedia Dictionary. What is a crisis? What is a crisis? Well, the Encyclopedia tells me there are 2 ways of understanding crisis. Yeah. So, put it simply, as a definition matter, crisis has 2 meanings. First, as a time of intense difficulty and or danger, which we can perhaps all agree that Mexican society is facing, although it is very important to highlight that this danger is not evenly distributed across society. Yeah? Some parts of the country and some groups in Mexican society are more affected than others, and this again highlights the issue of inequality that I just referred to. But there is a second form of understanding of crisis, and that is as a time when a difficult or important decision must be made. Okay? It is not clear to me, and again, with the caveats of an outsider, regrettably, that when it comes to the violence that afflicts contemporary Mexican society, there is a shared understanding that it is in a crisis in this sense. I will return to this point in a few moments, particularly in relation to what can be done to advance a sense of urgency and stress the need for transformational change. My second point, scope of state obligations for human rights. And now I become legalese, and caveat, I'm not an international lawyer, I do know a little bit about international law. So, before turning to this more political question, which could perhaps be framed as what is to be done, how can international human rights law help us make sense of where responsibility lies, and who has obligations to improve the situation? Again, simply put, there are a few considerations that I think are relevant for the Mexican situation. And just in summary form, because Maria already referred to a few of those. First, under international human rights law, states undertake to ensure that any person whose rights are violated shall have an effective remedy, and that the competent authorities shall enforce such remedies when granted. This is from those interested in international law, from the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 2. Now, over time, in general terms, this state obligation has developed to include the right of victims of human rights violation, as well as the family members, to justice, reparations, and the truth. Now, states assume obligations when formally agreeing to comply with international law, but it is governments who are responsible to ensure that these responsibilities are assumed. these responsibilities are the same regardless of what previous governments have or have not done. And it could be argued that when faced with a failure of a previous government to protect human rights, the responsibility of its successor becomes even greater. Yeah. Second, any federal state, and just make this point because obviously this has bearing on what we're discussing tonight, but also more broadly in Mexico, any federal state, assuming international human rights obligations is responsible to ensure that all the constituent parts of that state are in compliance with international obligations. Yeah? Third, under international human rights law, states have positive obligations to protect those within their jurisdiction from abuses, not just by state agents, but of course from non-state actors. So to be clear, these obligations even extend to those cases where state agents are not the direct perpetrators of abuses. So, in this regard, it should be added, of course, that based on the information available concerning disappeared students, what is striking, of course, is the direct involvement of state agents, police officers, as well as the alleged complicity of security forces and elected local politicians in the abuses committed. And indeed, what is so alarming for many, I believe, is that with the human rights situation in Mexico is precisely the extent to which criminal groups appear to have become embedded in political institutions and the apparent intimate relationships that exist between elected politicians, state level and local security forces, and criminal actors. According to some reports, these are relationships that make it very difficult at times, and this is what you were referring to now. These make it very difficult times, and or difficult at times, and in some places, to distinguish between these various groups. Yeah. Third point, and this is kind of a concern that Maria has already touched upon, and this is the specific human rights crime of enforced disappearances. I just want to reiterate this because it is important, I believe. Now, each act of disappearance has a name associated with it. Yeah? Each act of disappearance has a name associated with it. But the main point that I think I would like to convey here is the kind of deeply corrosive effect on society more generally that disappearances have, both in terms of the practice of the crime as well as the effects of the crime. This is not only for the immediate family, but for society more broadly. So, Maria already referred to the definition of the crime of enforced disappearances. If I were kind of better prepared, I would have a very nice kind of definitional kind of paragraph here. But I won't read it out, but just highlight the main points of the definition here, just to get it kind of clear in our minds here. So, enforced disappearances, according to what Maria already referred to, the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances. What are the elements of the definition? Well, enforced disappearance happens when there is an arrest, detention, abduction, or any other form of deprivation of liberty by whom? Who's responsible here now? By agents of the states, or, not just agents of the state, but also persons or groups of persons acting with the authorization, support, or acquiescence of the state, followed, and this is important, followed by a refusal to acknowledge the deprivation of liberty or concealing the fate of the whereabouts of those who disappeared, okay, and placing such a person outside the protection of the law. Now, this legal definition of the crime does not capture the drama and, yes, the crisis of enforced disappearances. And it's particularly a crisis when society is facing when such practices become widespread. Now, as Amnesty International points out, and I quote here, kind of emotive language about the impact of enforced disappearances, but they say, and based of course on decades of working across the globe with these practices, not just in Latin America, obviously not just in Mexico, but more broadly, perhaps a cross-cultural experience here. So, what they say is that very often people who have disappeared are never released and their fate remains unknown. Their families and friends may never find out what happened to them, but the person has not just vanished. Yeah? Someone, somewhere, knows what has happened to them. Someone is responsible. End of Now, it is largely for these reasons that the crime of enforced disappearance gives rise to quite specific obligations on the state to establish the truth about what happened, pursue accountability for those responsible, and seek repair for the harm done. Now, that is the law. Yeah, and you can just say, well, that sounds neat and sounds very, very nice. And yes, we would like to live in a world where that law has some strength and perhaps apply. Now, I haven't even touched upon the kind of relevant domestic Mexican law because, of course, these type of practices are not lawful in Mexican law. But I think a perfectly legitimate question could be, what is the practical relevance of the law in this regard? Now, the easy way out for me here was to say, well, I'll leave that to you to decide, and that's effectively what lawyers tend to do. Yeah, it's not my problem I say as a lawyer, but I try to be a lawyer fairly miserably. But I'm not just going to leave it like that for you to decide. I mean, obviously you need to decide that for yourselves, but just some concluding thoughts here. Now, what I've been trying to point out here is that the human rights analysis, a legal human rights analysis, helps to identify standards against which the performance of governments and societies can be measured. Yes, of course, they are, in most cases, international standards, but they gain salience through the efforts of individuals and groups to give them meaning locally. Human rights can empower in this sense and highlight that what matters is not what governments say, but effectively what they do. Perhaps we can take some comfort in the fact that the disappeared students have prompted reactions by parts of Mexican society, which have, of course, as you all know, mobilized in response to these violations. Now, it's far too early to tell, of course, whether the fates of the students can become catalysts for change. Yet, if we look, and I think this is why we're here, in part, or why I'm here, I should say, if we look beyond Mexico and to the histories of other Latin American societies, it was in many ways the desaparecidos that generated most resistance to authoritarian regimes in an earlier historical period. So what we can learn from this, and now I'm kind of allowing myself to sound like a historian, what can we learn? Historians do that, right? What can we learn from history? Some, not all, but what can we learn from this history? Well, it is that the demands for the truth about what happened to loved ones are not likely to go away. Okay? And democratic governments better take note of this history because at least one can expect them to do better than the authoritarian predecessors. So I'll leave you with that. So thank you very much for your attention.
Very good.